My name is Nathaniel Cole, and before everything fell apart, I thought I understood who I was. I was 34 years old when this story truly began, a logistics officer in the United States Army, with 12 years of service behind me, and a chest full of quiet pride I never spoke about. I wasn't famous, wealthy, or influential, but I believed in duty, structure, and promises. I stood 6 feet tall, lean from years of drills and deployments, with hands roughened by equipment crates and long nights of preparation. I had the kind of face people described as dependable rather than handsome, the kind of man others trusted to show up when things went wrong. At least, that's what I thought my life said about me before the list changed everything. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met Lena when I was 28 and she was 26, in a coffee shop just outside Fort Bracken. She was there grading papers, hair tied back in a loose knot, glasses sliding down her nose as she frowned at essays with exaggerated seriousness. She was a middle school literature teacher, passionate about words, stories, and the idea that people could be better if they just learned how to read life correctly. I ordered black coffee. She ordered something with too much foam, and when the barista mixed up our cups, we laughed and ended up talking for an hour. She said my uniform made me look intimidating, but my voice ruined the effect. I told her she looked like someone who noticed details others missed. That was how it started. Simple, almost forgettable, which is why it felt so real. We dated for 3 years before we married. Years shaped by training cycles, short deployments, and long-distance calls that always ended too soon. Lena said she admired my discipline, that my commitment to service made her feel safe, anchored. I admired her patience and her belief in growth, the way she could see potential in broken things. When we married, I was 31 and she was 29, standing under an open sky with borrowed chairs and wildflowers because neither of us wanted extravagance. She wore a simple dress, no veil, and cried when she said her vows. I remember thinking, with a certainty that felt unshakable, that I had chosen correctly, that whatever the world threw at us, we would face it as one unit. By the time the Iran-Israel war erupted and global tensions hardened into something unmistakably real, we had been married just over 2 years. I was promoted to senior logistics coordinator, responsible for supply chains that stretched across continents, ensuring units had what they needed when everything else was chaos. Lena had moved into school administration, becoming an assistant principal, juggling schedules and crises with the same care she once gave her students' essays. We lived in a modest house near base, not flashy but stable, the kind of place meant for building a future slowly. We talked about children after the next deployment, about travel when things calmed down, about forever as if it were a guaranteed benefit rather than a fragile promise. My cousin Marcus had always been the opposite of me in every measurable way. He was 2 years older, inherited wealth through smart timing and smarter parents, and had never worn a uniform in his life. He lived in glass and steel, talked in investments and opportunities, and moved through the world as if it were built to accommodate him. Growing up, family gatherings always turned him into a comparison point. The successful one, the golden example. He liked to say I was brave and he was smart, as if those traits occupied separate worlds. Lena met him at our wedding, and I remember noticing how he lingered too long in conversation, how he smiled with a confidence I'd never needed to cultivate. I ignored the discomfort because trust, I believed, meant silence in the face of doubt. When my orders came, they came fast and without ceremony. Deployment to support coalition logistics in a rapidly escalating conflict zone tied to the Iran-Israel war effort, with limited communication windows and unpredictable timelines. Lena hugged me tightly the night before I left, pressing her forehead to mine and telling me she would be strong for both of us. I promised to write, to call when I could, to come back the same man I was leaving as. I boarded the transport plane believing distance would test us, but not break us. That love reinforced by sacrifice only grew stronger. I didn't know that absence creates space, and space, when filled with the wrong presence, can become something lethal. Combat zones teach you how small your personal worries are compared to survival, yet they also sharpen your mind in dangerous ways. Between coordinating supply drops and managing delays caused by missile threats and shifting alliances, I found myself clinging to routine. I reread Lena's messages, studied photos of our home, and replayed her voice notes during sleepless nights. Sometimes her replies came late, sometimes they were short, but I told myself that leadership roles were demanding, that stress changed communication. The irony is painful now. How carefully I constructed explanations to protect the image I needed to survive out there, because believing in us gave meaning to everything else. The list came months later, after I returned stateside, thinner, quieter, and eager to step back into the life I preserved in my head. It wasn't Lena who handed it to me. It was a woman I'd never met before, sitting across from me in a quiet office, sliding a folder across a polished table with a practiced calm. On the front page, in bold, unforgiving letters, were words that didn't make sense yet. My fiancée betrayed me with my rich cousin. I didn't understand then that this was only the beginning, that before betrayal became a storm, it arrived as a list, neat, deliberate, and devastating. I stared at the folder for a long time before I opened it, because instinct told me that once I did, there would be no going back to the man I was just minutes before. The woman across from me introduced herself as Rachel, a paralegal working for a private firm that handled asset disputes and family litigation. Her voice was neutral, almost rehearsed, as if she had learned long ago how to deliver destruction without absorbing it. She told me she was not authorized to offer opinions, only facts, and that what I held in my hands had been compiled over several months. My hand shook despite everything I'd endured overseas, because this was a different kind of battlefield, one where preparation offered no protection and courage had nowhere to stand. The first page wasn't dramatic. It listed dates, addresses, financial transfers, and phone records, all typed with clinical precision. I had coordinated supply routes under missile threat. Yet nothing had prepared me for seeing my wife's name aligned beside my cousin's, repeated again and again like a cruel equation. Hotel reservations matched times I was unreachable due to operations. Receipts showed expenses far beyond our shared accounts, all covered by Marcus. There were notes explaining context, written as if for a judge, but each sentence felt like a blade carefully pressed against memory. The betrayal wasn't emotional yet. It was logistical, mapped out like one of my own operations, efficient and undeniable. Rachel explained that Marcus had been engaged to another woman, one with her own suspicions and the resources to investigate them. When the truth surfaced, lawyers became involved and collateral damage followed. My name appeared because I was legally tied to Lena, because finances overlapped, and because the affair had implications beyond personal pain. She told me, gently, that Lena had already been contacted, that statements were taken, and that silence on my part would not prevent what was coming. As she spoke, I realized the list wasn't meant to inform me. It was meant to prepare me for reality already set in motion without my consent. What broke me wasn't the evidence. It was the clarity. In war, confusion is constant, but here there was none. I could trace the arc of their relationship from polite family conversations to private flights and hidden weekends. I saw moments I remembered from deployment, missed calls, brief messages, now annotated with explanations that made my stomach turn. While I was managing supply shortages and counting down minutes between alerts, my absence had become opportunity. The thought hollowed me out because I had believed my sacrifice was protecting something sacred. Instead, it had left a vacuum my own blood had filled. When I finally asked Rachel why she was telling me all this instead of my wife, she paused. She said Lena had denied wrongdoing at first, then shifted to justifications: loneliness, fear, uncertainty. Marcus, on the other hand, had framed it as inevitability, as if wealth and proximity were natural forces that could not be resisted. Hearing that stripped away the last fragile excuse I've been holding on to, the idea that this was some tragic misunderstanding. This wasn't chaos. It was choice, repeated deliberately, while I lived and operated under a code that demanded loyalty even when it hurt. I drove home afterward without music, without calling anyone, replaying every conversation I'd had with Lena during deployment. I remember reassuring her when she sounded distant, apologizing for things I couldn't control, thanking her for being patient. The house looked the same when I arrived, lights on, her car in the driveway, but it felt staged, like a set built to deceive. I sat in my vehicle for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, realizing that the man who walked inside would not be the same one who had left for war. Knowledge had armed me, but it had also wounded me beyond anything physical. When I finally confronted her, I didn't raise my voice. I placed a folder on the table between us and watched her expression collapse in stages: confusion, fear, then resignation. She cried, said my name as if it were a lifeline, and tried to explain how it just happened, how Marcus understood her loneliness, how she never meant for it to go this far. I listened, strangely calm, because the list had already done its work. Her words couldn't compete with dates and transactions. I realized in that love, once documented like evidence, loses its ability to argue. That night, I slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the past with brutal accuracy. I saw myself proposing, deploying, trusting. I saw Marcus smiling at family dinners, clapping me on the shoulder, calling me a hero. I understood that betrayal doesn't announce itself. It embeds, waits, and strikes when you're focused elsewhere. The war had taught me how to survive external enemies. But this lesson was different. This was about rebuilding identity after discovering that the foundation you trusted was never secure at all. The days after the confrontation moved slowly, like time itself was reluctant to carry me forward. Lena tried to talk, to apologize in long, trembling explanations that mixed regret with self-preservation. But I had reached a strange emotional stillness. It wasn't forgiveness or rage. It was a numb clarity that comes after shock, when your mind finally accepts that denial is no longer useful. I continued my routines out of habit, morning runs, paperwork, briefings. Yet everything felt hollow, as if I were operating a body that no longer belonged to me. The war had trained me to compartmentalize pain, but this was different. This was personal, intimate, and rooted in family, which made it harder to isolate without losing pieces of myself. What unsettled me most was the realization that Marcus hadn't simply betrayed me once. He had maintained a relationship with me throughout the affair. I replayed memories with fresh eyes, his casual texts asking how deployment was going, his comments about holding things down back home, his offers to help Lena if she ever needed anything. Each interaction now carried a double meaning, transforming from brotherly concern into calculated deception. Blood had always meant obligation in my family, a quiet rule that you protected your own no matter what. Understanding that Marcus had violated that code so thoroughly forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Shared DNA does not guarantee shared values, and familiarity can be the perfect camouflage for betrayal. I eventually met Marcus face to face, not out of desire for confrontation, but because unresolved conflicts are liabilities, and I had learned the cost of leaving loose ends. He greeted me with forced confidence, dressed impeccably as always, as if well could armor him against accountability. He spoke first, launching into explanations about loneliness, inevitability, and emotional drift, framing the affair as something that developed naturally. I listened without interruption, studying the ease with which he justified crossing boundaries I would never have approached. When I finally spoke, I told him that combat had taught me many things, but the most important was this. Trust is the most valuable currency in any operation, and once spent recklessly, it cannot be replenished. The encounter didn't end with shouting or violence, which surprised even me. Instead, it ended with distance, the kind that forms when two people finally recognize they occupy incompatible moral terrain. I walked away understanding that reconciliation requires shared accountability, and Marcus possessed none. That realization was painful, but also clarifying. I no longer needed to compete with him, impress him, or measure myself against his success. His wealth had not made him richer in character, and my service had not protected me from loss, but had given me a framework for honor that I could still stand on when everything else fell apart. At home, Lena's presence became increasingly unbearable, not because of anger, but because familiarity now felt like intrusion. Every shared space echoed with choices she had made while I was gone. Every apology reminded me that loyalty should not require persuasion. Eventually, we agreed to separate temporarily, a term that felt dishonest but manageable. I packed only essentials and moved into a small furnished apartment near base, a sterile space that mirrored my internal landscape. Alone at night, I confronted the reality that marriage, like war, can end without a clear victory or defeat, just survivors trying to redefine themselves in the aftermath. Sleep came in fragments, often interrupted by memories that blended combat stress with personal loss. I would wake up disoriented, unsure whether the tightness in my chest came from remembered explosions or imagined conversations that could never fix what was broken. Yet, in those quiet hours, I also began to reflect honestly on myself, stripping away assumptions I had carried for years. I saw how much of my identity had been built around service, sacrifice, and endurance, and how little I had prepared for vulnerability. The betrayal hurt deeply, but it also exposed areas where I had equated strength with silence, believing that providing and protecting were substitutes for presence. By the end of that week, something subtle shifted. The pain remained, but it was no longer the only voice in my head. Clarity began to emerge, fragile but real, whispering that survival is not the same as living, and that integrity is tested not only by external enemies, but by the choices you make when the people closest to you fail you. I didn't know what the next chapter of my life would look like, but I knew this. I would not let the betrayal define the limits of my future. The war had taken enough from me. I would decide what this loss would take, and what it would not. The separation forced me into a kind of solitude I had never truly experienced before. The sort that doesn't feel empty at first, but slowly reveals how much noise once existed around you. In my apartment, there were no shared routines, no compromises over space, no lingering reminders disguised as comfort. I ate when I wanted, slept when exhaustion overtook me, and filled my evenings with quiet reflection instead of conversation. At first, the silence felt like punishment, an extension of loss. But over time it became something else entirely. It became a tool. In the military, silence before an operation is intentional, a moment to gather focus and accept reality. I began to treat this period the same way, not as exile, but as preparation. Lena continued to reach out, alternating between apologies and rationalizations, sometimes within the same message. She spoke about therapy, about confusion, about how the war had scared her more than she ever admitted. I didn't dismiss her pain outright, but I stopped absorbing it as responsibility. For years, I had believed that being a good husband meant carrying emotional weight quietly, absorbing pressure so others could function. Now I understood that doing so without boundaries had cost me more than I realized. Silence, in this case, wasn't avoidance. It was containment. I needed space to determine what I believed, not what I was expected to forgive. Professionally, I requested reassignment to a stateside strategic planning unit, a move that surprised some of my superiors but made perfect sense to me. I needed structure without immediacy, purpose without constant threat. The work involved long hours analyzing supply vulnerabilities, political ripple effects, and contingency responses tied to the ongoing Iran-Israel conflict. Ironically, it was this distance from active combat that allowed me to confront my personal war more honestly. Strategy teaches you to anticipate outcomes, to recognize patterns, and to accept losses without romanticizing them. Applying that mindset to my marriage felt cold at first, but it was necessary. Emotion without assessment had already failed me once. News of Marcus reached me indirectly, through family channels that suddenly felt unreliable. His engagement had collapsed publicly, legal proceedings unfolding with an efficiency that mirrored the list that had found me. Some relatives expressed sympathy. Others urged reconciliation for the sake of family unity. I listened without responding, recognizing a familiar pattern. Pressure disguised as tradition. In combat, you learn quickly that orders not aligned with reality get people hurt. I wasn't interested in symbolic unity if it required sacrificing self-respect. Blood might explain proximity, but it didn't excuse violation. I marked him emotionally as compromised territory and adjusted my boundaries accordingly. As weeks passed, I began to notice subtle changes in myself. I no longer checked my phone compulsively. I slept more consistently. I started running not just for fitness, but for clarity, letting repetitive motion burn away intrusive thoughts. I even returned to an old habit I'd abandoned years earlier, writing, not reports or after-action summaries, but personal accounts, fragmented at first, then increasingly coherent, putting words of betrayal stripped it of some of its power. It transformed pain from an overwhelming force into something measurable, something I could examine instead of endure blindly. I realized that narrative matters, and if I didn't tell my own story, others would define it for me. Lena eventually asked to meet, not to argue or plead, but to discuss what came next. We sat across from each other in a neutral space, both visibly altered by time and consequence. She spoke more carefully now, less defensively, as if she finally understood that remorse doesn't entitle you to restoration. I told her the truth as calmly as I could. That trust isn't rebuilt through explanation, but through consistency over time, and even then, it isn't guaranteed. I wasn't making promises, only acknowledging reality. Walking away from that meeting, I felt no triumph, only resolve. Sometimes the bravest decision is refusing to rush toward familiarity simply because it once felt safe. By the end of the month, I understood something fundamental had shifted within me. The man who boarded a plane believing loyalty was automatic had been replaced by someone who understood its cost. Silence had taught me discernment. Distance had clarified value. I didn't know whether my marriage would survive or whether my family ties would ever fully recover, but I knew this much. I would no longer confuse endurance with love or sacrifice with invisibility. The war had shown me how fragile order can be. Betrayal had shown me how necessary self-respect is. Whatever came next, I would meet it deliberately, eyes open and uncompromised. By the time autumn arrived, the world had settled into a deceptive rhythm, one where everything appeared functional on the surface, while fractures widened underneath. My reassigned role kept me busy, buried in projections, diplomatic constraints, and long-term logistics tied to a conflict that showed no real signs of resolution. Yet even as I briefed others on resilience and sustainability, I was quietly undergoing a reckoning of my own. It wasn't dramatic or visible. There were no confrontations, no tearful breakdowns in public spaces. Instead, it unfolded privately, in moments when I realized how deeply betrayal had altered my instincts, how trust no longer came naturally, and how every promise now triggered analysis instead of comfort. What surprised me most was not the anger toward Lena or Marcus, but the disappointment I felt toward myself. I had prided myself on perception, on reading situations accurately under pressure, yet I had missed the slow erosion happening in my own home. That realization haunted me more than the affair itself, because it challenged the identity I had relied on for years. I began questioning how much of my confidence had been borrowed from roles and routines, rather than earned through honest self-awareness. In combat, failure is often attributed to external variables. In marriage, there is no such distance. Accountability sits uncomfortably close, demanding examination without excuses. Family gatherings became rarer, then non-existent, not out of hostility, but out of necessity. Every interaction carried subtext. Every question felt loaded, as if people were measuring my recovery against their expectations. Some treated me like a victim who needed reassurance, others like an obstacle to reconciliation that would restore normalcy. I declined invitations politely, understanding that healing doesn't occur on someone else's schedule. Distance allowed me to grieve without performance, to process without commentary. I learned that closure isn't granted by consensus. It's claimed through deliberate choice, often in isolation. Lena and I communicated sporadically, mostly about logistics, documents, finances, shared responsibilities that refused to dissolve just because emotions had. She had moved out of our house, a decision that felt symbolic even before it was practical. There was no dramatic farewell, No final argument, just an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever we had been was no longer intact enough to inhabit together. I didn't feel relief so much as acceptance, the quiet understanding that some endings don't announce themselves loudly. They simply stop asking for continuation. One afternoon, I received an unexpected message from Marcus. It was brief, carefully worded, and devoid of apology. He spoke about time, perspective, and regret in abstract terms, as if addressing a market downer rather than a human violation. I didn't respond, not because I lack words, but because I finally understood that engagement implies equivalence, and there was none. Silence, in this instance, wasn't avoidance. It was verdict. Some people seek forgiveness to relieve themselves, not to restore what they broke. I refused to participate in that transaction. As the months progressed, I noticed something else emerging beneath the pain. Discernment. I began recognizing patterns I had once ignored, both in others and in myself. I saw how easily admiration can be mistaken for compatibility, how stability can be confused with intimacy, and how sacrifice, when unbalanced, becomes silent erosion. These realizations didn't make me cynical, but they did make me precise. I stopped romanticizing endurance and started valuing reciprocity. Trust, I learned, is not proven by how much you can withstand, but by how consistently both parties choose integrity when no one is watching. The final shift came quietly, during a routine briefing where I was asked how long a system could operate under strain before failure became inevitable. Without thinking, I answered honestly, longer than expected, but not indefinitely. Afterward, the metaphor lingered. I realized that I had reached a point where prolonging the familiar would cost more than rebuilding something new. That clarity didn't erase loss, but it reframed it. The betrayal no longer defined me. It informed me. It didn't dictate my future. It refined my standards. By the end of that season, I was no longer waiting for apologies or explanations. I wasn't seeking justice or revenge. I was rebuilding slowly, deliberately, and on my own terms. The war had tested my endurance. Betrayal had tested my identity. What remained was choice. And for the first time since the list crossed that table toward me, I understood that survival was never the goal. Integrity was. By winter, I stopped measuring my life in terms of what had been taken and started accounting for what remained intact. My work continued, steady and demanding, but it no longer served as a hiding place. Instead, it became one pillar among several, no longer carrying the entire weight of my identity. I began volunteering with a veterans transition group, not as a leader or example, but as a participant willing to listen. Hearing others speak about betrayal, loss, and the disorientation of returning to a world that moved on without them reminded me that my experience, while deeply personal, was not unique. Shared pain did not dilute my own, but it contextualized it, transforming isolation into connection without requiring explanation. The legal process is finalized quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Lena and I signed papers in a neutral office, exchanging polite acknowledgments that felt strangely respectful given everything that had passed between us. There were no accusations left to voice, no revelations to uncover. The truth had already done its work. I wished her well, not as an absolution, but as a boundary, an acknowledgement that my future no longer required proximity to her choices. Walking out of that office, I felt lighter, not because I had won anything, but because I had stopped carrying what was never mine to fix. Closure, I learned, is less about answers and more about permission to move forward without them. Family dynamics shifted permanently, settling into a new equilibrium that excluded certain assumptions I once took for granted. Some relationships faded, others adapted, and a few surprised me with their resilience. I stopped trying to explain my decisions in detail, realizing that those who respected them did not need justification, and those who didn't would never be convinced. Marcus became a distant figure, mentioned rarely and without emotion. I didn't harbor hatred toward him. Hatred requires energy, and I had redirected mine toward building something durable. Indifference, I discovered, is not coldness, it is freedom reclaimed. Personally, I began to invest in habits that aligned with who I was becoming rather than who I had been expected to be. I continued writing, shaping fragmented reflections into coherent narratives, not for publication, but for understanding. Words allowed me to trace growth without denying pain, to see progression without pretending the past didn't matter. I traveled when I could, modest trips that emphasized presence over escape, places where anonymity offered clarity instead of loneliness. I learned to enjoy my own company again, not as a defense mechanism, but as evidence that my worth did not depend on constant validation or shared identity. Trust returned slowly, cautiously, and selectively. I didn't rush new connections or mistake attention for intimacy. When I did meet someone new, I was honest about my boundaries without turning them into armor. I understood now that vulnerability is not recklessness, and caution is not fear. It is simply discernment informed by experience. I no longer equated transparency with obligation or patience with tolerance for disrespect. These distinctions didn't make relationships harder. They made them cleaner, grounded in mutual choice rather than assumption. For the first time, I felt aligned rather than reactive. Occasionally, memories resurfaced, deployment nights, familiar laughter, moments that once symbolized permanence. They no longer arrived with sharpness, but with a muted clarity that allowed me to acknowledge them without being pulled backward. I didn't rewrite the past and make myself faultless, nor did I shoulder blame that wasn't mine. I accepted complexity, understanding that people are capable of sincerity and betrayal, sometimes simultaneously. That acceptance didn't excuse harm, but it freed me from the illusion that certainty is required for peace. Ambiguity, when faced honestly, can coexist with resolve. The title of that list, the one that first unraveled my certainty, still echoes occasionally in my mind, not as an accusation, but as a marker. It reminds me of the moment illusion gave way to truth, when identity collapsed and had to be rebuilt deliberately. I don't resent that moment anymore. It forced clarity where comfort had once lived, and clarity, while painful, proved essential. I survived war abroad and betrayal at home, but survival was never the end point. Transformation was. Today, when I introduce myself, I still give my name and my profession, but I no longer lead with them as definitions. They are parts of my story, not its sum. I am a man who learned that loyalty must be mutual, that silence can be strategic, and that self-respect is not negotiable. I am no longer waiting for vindication or reconciliation. I am moving forward with intention, grounded, aware, and unafraid of solitude. The list did not end me. It began me. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.